Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is the second installment from an exclusive story sent over by my good friend Brandy Gray. The first installment of this series was quite some time back at the start of the year, I believe, if not the end of last year. And Brandy's been kind enough to follow it up with a new installment. Of course, as ever, please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story. Entitled The Alpha's Responsibility. Part 2. Let's get straight into that. Daniel hadn't known what to say. His mind was in chaos. He couldn't deny anymore that he was awake, which meant werewolves were real. Oddly enough, that was starting to become easier to wrap his mind around than the fact that he was now one. He didn't feel any different. Well, that wasn't exactly true. He felt stronger somehow. He was still sore, but at the same time he felt healthier than he had ever done before in his life. He wasn't sure how long had passed since Mikhail had sighed and left the room. He didn't blame him. After all, he had just sat there and stared at him after his declaration. He was sitting on a small chest looking out the window. There were several children outside enjoying the snow, having a snowball fight and building snowmen. It all seemed so normal. He noticed one boy who looked to be around 8 throwing snowballs at a smaller girl. She didn't look any older than 4. He just started to think how unfair that was when the boy turned away and the girl dropped down to all fours before launching herself onto the boy's back and knocking him face down into the snow. This caused a round of laughter from the nearby children and the parents watching them play. It seemed she could take care of herself, at least. He hadn't once thought of escape since Mikhail had left the room. He was right. No one would believe what had happened to him. He wasn't even sure he did, and if someone did believe him, it would only get him killed. He wasn't sure if that would be a better alternative or not. Mikhail hadn't went into much detail about what all this meant. Of course, he hadn't really given him a chance to. These people were his only chance of understanding what he was now. How could he control himself, if such a thing were possible? He didn't think he could handle it if he accidentally hurt someone. "I've gone insane," he said aloud and jumped when he heard the door opening behind him. He turned to see Arista in the doorway. She sat what looked like a bowl of soup down on the table by the bed. "Thank you," he said and turned back towards the window. He could still sense her behind him, but she didn't come any closer. He turned back to face her. "My husband trusts you," she said. He turned away again to look out the window. Most of the children were already gone, or were heading back inside. Must be dinner time. "You don't?" he asked finally when she just stood there. He couldn't face her for some reason, like he'd done something wrong, which is crazy, considering what they'd done to him. "I don't know if I can trust you. You're one of us now, but you're a stranger." And she was quiet for a moment. "We haven't had much luck with strangers, but my husband has a very kind and trusting nature. He got it from his father." He turned back to her then. "That's a bad thing." And she shrugged, but her words were sad. "I got him, and many others of our family killed," she said before finally leaving the room. Hours later, he turned when the door eased open just a crack and an unfamiliar face peeked in. It was a woman. She looked straight at the bed and opened the door farther to look into the rest of the room. It was dim, and there was apparently still no power, and he hadn't bothered lighting the kerosene lamp, but she didn't seem to have a problem spotting him. "There you are. Sorry, I would have knocked louder, but I was afraid you'd be asleep." He shook his head. He was exhausted, and he had tried to go to sleep earlier, but his thoughts were racing too much for his mind to shut off when he tried to lay in bed. Oddly enough, sitting here looking out into the night had calmed his racing thoughts. The night was peaceful. No, I can't sleep. He could just about make out enough of the moonlight shining in to see her nod her head. And she stepped in and shut the door behind her without waiting for an invitation to do so. He heard the sound of a match striking and watched as the small flame moved to where he knew the bedside table sat. After that, the room was illuminated with light. Your eyesight probably improved some already, but it probably hasn't got up to peak yet. And she sat down on the bed and turned to him, offering him a smile. Hello, my name's Veronica. I spoke to Mikkel, or the Alpha. And she shook her head. I'm sorry, still having trouble wrapping my head around that one. Anyway, he said that you won't leave the room. He said he tried to talk to you a bit earlier, but you were still in shock. He asked me if I'd come check on you. You must have questions. Oh, he had questions. So many, in fact, he didn't know where to start. They both jumped when they heard the door slam, and he turned back towards the window when he noticed movement out the corner of his eye. He could just about make out Regis storming off into the trees. He was here? He asked with concern. It was probably a good thing he hadn't left the room. He turned back to the girl when she sighed. He has been since the fight. He was pretty banged up. Helene insisted he stay until he was well enough to move. And she shrugged her shoulders. She worries for him. He is her grandson, after all. He shook his head. I don't understand how someone like him can be related to Mikkel. It was strange. The man had admitted to biting him and turning him into a werewolf, yet he couldn't force himself to hate him. He just seemed like too good a person for that. I can't imagine you'd like him very much, seeing how adamant he's been about killing you all this time, she said with a sigh. Personally, I can't stand him anymore. The way he treats Alma. He didn't used to be like that, though. Before he lost his wife, he was a good person. Sad and way overprotective. But he never would have treated her that way. He worshipped the ground that she walked on, as they say. Sad? He asked. He was being nosy, but he also was delaying the inevitable. The longer he could go without having to think about what he was now, the better. And she nodded. Mikkel and Regis had a younger sister. As oldest, the responsibility of watching over the two of them fell on Regis. Once he became an adult, Mikkel liked to run on his own, but as CastBox was still young, only 16 at the time, he was still responsible for her. And she was killed by a hunter, about 18 years ago I think it was. Not even a werewolf hunter, just a hunter. CastBox had a thing. Every time she came across an animal in a hunter's trap, she set it free. Said every creature deserved a fighting chance. There was a hunter that lived nearby, kept bear traps, snares and other traps, set up all over his property, and every night she'd set them off and free every poor creature unfortunate enough to get themselves caught. And finally, he got wise. He had a trap set up with a young buck in it, and then he hid nearby, coated himself in deer urine to hide his scent, and waited. And CastBox, she took the bait. Her and Regis were out for a run. He hates himself for hanging back and waiting, but he did. The hunter came out screaming and shot her several times. Regis tore him to shreds. And Daniel sat back in silence. He couldn't really say he blamed Regis for what he had done to the hunter, having to watch someone he loved die like that. And he swallowed hard. So, he said with a sigh, silver bullets? And she laughed a little. Just a myth. Like all men, any kind of bullet can kill us. It is a fatal shot, heart or brain. Anything else and we can heal from it. He stood from the trunk and went to sit beside her on the bed. What else? He asked with a sigh. Might as well get it over with. The sooner he came to terms with what was happening, the sooner he could move on with his life, or what was left of it. Can kill you? She asked and smiled, patting his hand. The whole wolfsbane thing is true, though to be fair that would kill anyone who ingests it, though it's a bit more painful for us. But things like cancer or heart disease are no longer something you have to worry about. Well, until you're older. Once you get to be as old as Helene and Nicholas, whatever it is that keeps us strong starts to fade. Though, as you probably can tell, not quickly. And they will both be turning 87 this year. And Helene's mother is still alive at the age of 104. Rowan can't shift anymore, but she can still get around after the little ones when they get on her nerves, she said with a laugh. He blinked in shock. It wasn't like he hadn't heard of people living to be that old before, but she made it sound like that was the norm for her kind. Their kind. Okay, that's probably enough for tonight. You look like you're gonna pass out on me. He shook his head, and the more he tried to wrap his mind around everything, the more exhausted he became. Don't worry, I'll stop by tomorrow and we'll talk more. I'll answer any question you have. Well, as long as I know the answer. He nodded as she stood and pulled his blankets down for him, and she patted the bed and smiled. Your husband won't mind? He asked as she stood. He wasn't quite sure why he'd asked her that. He hadn't seen a ring, though that might not have meant much for werewolves, and she laughed a little. If that was one of those weird man ways of asking me if I'm single, then yes, I am, she sighed. I was almost married once, but thankfully I got out of it, and she started for the door. Thankfully? She turned back and nodded, and he stretched out across the bed. Very thankfully. I almost ended up married to Regis. And he sat back up and waved his head towards her. Why would you ever want to marry him? He asked, lowering his voice when he remembered he was currently in a man's grandparents' home, and she shook her head. I wouldn't, and that's why I'm so thankful Nicholas got me out of it. But, and she interrupted him, no more buts, I promise. We'll talk tomorrow, but you need sleep. Your body's still changing, and you'll be back to normal in a few days. Well, normal is a relative term, but still, she said, offering him a smile. He sighed and lay back down, letting his eyes drift, closed. His sleep had been dreamless, thank goodness. He wouldn't even let his mind revisit the nightmares he was expecting to have. And the sun was high in the sky when he awoke. He couldn't be sure, but it was probably nearly 3 in the morning when Veronica left. He moved to the edge of the bed and sighed. He ignored the soup that Arista had brought him, hadn't touched the pitcher of water that Helene had sat next to his bed, and now he was starving and thirsty. He couldn't do much about the hunger at the moment, but he reached out and poured himself glass after glass of water, till he finished half of the pitcher. He stood. He needed food and more answers. Mikhail had told him he wasn't a prisoner, but he also knew he couldn't live in Helene and Nicholas's back room for the rest of his life. He was cautious as he stepped out of the room. If Regis had come back, he didn't think he was in any shape for a confrontation. And the house was relatively quiet, except for some small banging noises coming from somewhere off the small dining room they'd eaten in their meal in the other night. It was a kitchen, and when he rounded the corner, he saw Helene standing at the sink, scrubbing dishes. Would you like some help with those? The old woman spun around like she hadn't noticed him approach, and grabbed at her chest, and for a brief moment he was afraid he'd given a poor woman a heart attack. He rushed forward to her side. Are you all right? Do you need me to go find someone? And she didn't respond at first, just scowled at him for a minute and then smacked him on the arm with a soapy hand. Didn't anyone ever tell you not to sneak up on an old lady? She said, but her wrinkly face cracked a grin, and he smiled back. Sorry, I thought you would have heard me. And he noticed that his own hearing seemed to be improving. He just assumed that she would have been able to hear him approaching. And she shook her head at him and turned back to her work. The hearing's one of the first things to go once you get to my age. And she turned back when his stomach grumbled audibly. But I still heard that, she said, offering him another smile. Go set a table. I'll make you some breakfast. And he started to protest, but he didn't want to impose, though at this point he was hungry enough to eat a horse. He was a bit surprised when she began pushing him out of the room. For an 86-year-old, she still had a good bit of strength. "Now, I don't want to hear it. You're a part of this pack now, and that makes you one of my grandbabies, and Nana takes care of her grandbabies." Her words had been sincere and full of feeling. He didn't know what to say. It was hard to consolidate the image of this woman, who was very much a kind of normal grandmother type, with the image of the wolf who had knocked him unconscious the other night with one hit. He sat down at the table and looked around. He noticed a clock on the wall by the front door. It was 1:30 in the afternoon. His nose took a sniff of the air when he smelled the bacon frying. He had been drooling any minute if he didn't distract himself. He stood and looked around. Maybe it wasn't wise to snoop through the house of the pack's patriarch and matriarch, but he had to occupy his mind somehow. Helene and Nicholas had a lot of plants in the small living room, dining room area, and not much else. There was a photograph wedged between two large potted ferns behind the table, and though they were younger, he clearly recognized Mikkel and Regis. Between them was a girl who appeared to be around 12 in the photo. It must have been that ill-fated sister, TeamFEAR. Behind the three, a man stood tall, one hand placed on both of the boy's shoulders, and he looked an awful lot like Mikkel. Beside him was a woman with a bright beaming smile. She had the same eyes and hair as Regis. Regis was smiling. He actually looked like a decent person in the photo. "My son, daughter-in-law, and granddaughter." He jumped and spun around. Helene took her sad eyes off the photo he was staring at to look up at him and offer him a small smile. "Not so fun being startled, is it, young man?" she said, setting his plate down on the table in front of him. He wasn't sure what to say. "Thank you," he said, finally sitting down in front of the food. Eggs, bacon, sausage. At least he didn't have to worry about cholesterol anymore. She sat down in front of him as he ate, and he was a little uncomfortable by the silence. She didn't break it until he finished every bite. "I see little Veronica had a good effect on you. At least you finally left the bedroom." He nodded. "She told me some things. She said she'd come by again today and we'd talk more," he said, looking past her to check the clock again. It was just after 2. Helene followed his gaze. "Are you eager to see her again?" she asked with a smile. "It's early yet. She'll just now be getting out of bed, and then she has school. She'll be by later." "Early?" It was afternoon. Granted, it had been late when she left, and what about school? If he had had to guess, he'd have said the woman looked to be in her late 20s. Maybe a college student. Helene seemed to sense his thoughts and said, "Most of us sleep the day away and stay up through the night. Some people have jobs that prevent that, but it's the way we prefer it. I'm sure you noticed, even this early into your change, the pull the night has for you." And the look in her eyes turned sad again. "Of course, I don't sleep much any time of day anymore. I haven't in years since that hunter came." And he looked down at his empty plate. "I'm sorry about what happened. Just so you know, I never would have." He trailed off. None of that mattered anymore, did it? "I can tell you're a good person. My Mikkel is a great judge of character, and don't you worry about my Regis. He's as grouchy as a bear, but he has a good heart in there somewhere still. I have to believe that." When she spoke, it was obvious he wasn't the only one she was trying to convince with that statement. He didn't think he was the only one that doubted it either. Instead of voicing it aloud, he asked, "She has school?" And Helene smiled. "Well, she's the school teacher. Classes go from 3 to 7 on weekdays. She teaches all the children, no matter what age. It's the first time since the pack began that the kids are getting a formal education. It's why Nicholas agreed to let her head off to college when she asked," Helene said with pride of any grandmother. "Well, that and she trailed off. He smiled a little, and so she was a school teacher to the children of the pack. He couldn't miss the uncomfortable look on her old, wrinkled face when she said, "And he couldn't help but ask. "And?" she sighed.
"Carmen, Regis' first wife, was Veronica's sister. Regis was in line to be alpha. Throughout history of our pack, Carmen and Veronica's family have been known to be the beauty of their woman, and for the strength of the pups, birthed by them. Carmen was promised to Regis the day she was born, but it wasn't just an arrangement between them. They loved each other greatly, and she was pregnant with his first pup when a hunter came. Regis was devastated. But since she was gone, the way our laws worked for generations meant the next oldest female in the line was now his, and that was Veronica. Regis wouldn't even discuss marrying someone else for years, and the longer he was alone, the more bitter he became. Then a few years ago, he decided it was time to remarry. But Nicholas sensed his bitterness and how afraid Veronica was to be his wife. So when Veronica came to him to ask to go to college, instead of marrying Regis, he jumped at the opportunity to send her away. After all, having someone with a teacher's degree teaching the next generations was what was best for the pack, and that would outweigh any previous arrangements. Regis was angry, and he was to be alpha. He needed a wife to pass on his seed and carry the line, so the duty of marrying Regis went to the next in line, her cousin, Alma.
"Didn't any of them have any kind of say in this?" he asked, voice rising in anger. He thought of a way Regis treated poor Alma. He had never seen him strike her, but he didn't doubt he did by the way the poor girl slinked around like an abused animal. Helene took a deep breath and sighed. "The werewolf community isn't nearly as advanced as the rest of the world. We women don't have nearly as many rights as the ones outside of our community."
"There you are!" Danny jumped and turned to the sound of the voice. He had been concentrating so hard on the things Helene had been saying that he hadn't even heard Nicholas approach. "You need to rest, love," he said in his old gravelly voice as he approached the table. He noticed that the woman did look absolutely exhausted. Nicholas turned to him. "You'll find Veronica at the schoolhouse. It's not far." He told him how to get there. "It would do you good to walk around, get to know your new home better," he said before leading a protesting Helene farther back into the home. He sighed and stood. This was his new home now. Like it or not, he might as well look around. It had been impossible to see much the night he escaped, and when he stepped outside, snow still covered the ground. But it was obvious most of it had melted away earlier in the day. Bits of earth peeked out from underneath. It was relatively quiet as he walked, and he wondered if most of the people in the trailers and shacks he passed were still asleep. It was possible. The way Helene had made it sound, the only people with young children would be up now, getting them ready for school, just like a normal family. Well, if it wasn't the middle of the afternoon. He found the building easily. It wasn't exactly what you would expect at a school, just an old metal building that looked like it might have been a mechanic's garage at some point, but it was definitely the biggest building he'd seen in the compound thus far. The inside of the garage looked very much like a classroom, at least to one side. There was a dry erase board with what he assumed to be the teacher's desk sitting directly in front of it. In front of those were about 30 heavily used student desks, the old ones with the chairs attached to them. There were a few other tables ringing the area. One held beakers, while the other was piled high with art supplies. "Daniel?" He turned to see Veronica. She was coming out of a door on the opposite side of the makeshift classroom, her arms full of small booklets. "Nicholas sent me over, I think just to get me out of the house mainly. Let me help with those," he said, reaching for the bundle in her arms. She smiled and walked over to set her half down on the desk. She looked up at the clock. "Well, the children will start arriving any minute, so we'll have to put the rest of our talk on hold, I'm afraid. If you're looking for something to do, how about sitting in class today? It's a lot different than what you're used to, I'm sure. I was homeschooled here like any of us who got any form of education. Where before now, but I did go off to college, and so I know things are vastly different out there. In my classroom, the children sit, starting from the back left in descending age. I work from front to back, assigning their tasks for the day. And I try to be available for each of them if they need help. But it's difficult when the little ones are on one side of the room working on the alphabet and the older ones on the other side of the room dissecting owl pellets. He nodded, unsure what to say. He supposed it wasn't feasible to have separate classrooms by grade like he was used to. For one thing, there was only one teacher. For another, there weren't nearly enough children to make up separate classes.
Might make it easier if you held 2 classes a day, split down the middle. Younger students earlier in the day and then the older students come in after them. It would mean more work for you, but it would make it easier to give them one-on-one time.
She sat down at her desk and smiled. That's perfect, actually. I'll talk to Nicholas later and see if he approves, she said, and then paused and shook her head. I mean, I'll talk to Mikkel about it later. This change is hard to get used to, she said with a laugh and stood. He turned to see the first of the students arriving. You can sit there if you want, she said, pointing to a chair to the side of her desk. He nodded and sat down. He felt sort of awkward. It reminded him of when he misbehaved in school as a child and was forced to spend the rest of the class doing his work at the teacher's desk. Within the next 5 minutes, all but 4 of the desks were full, and judging by the fact that the empty ones were side by side on the front row, he assumed all of the children were here. Welcome, class. As you see, we have a guest today. Everyone, this is Daniel Greene, and he's the newest member of our pack. A few of the older children started whispering among themselves, and he was surprised he was able to hear some of what they were saying. It seemed he was the subject of gossip at many of the students' households. All right, everyone, settle down. Get last night's homework ready for me, and then we'll start discussing today's lesson. The child on the bottom right row was a little girl who seemed to be no more than 5, and she excitedly held out her workbook to show Veronica where she'd copied her alphabet. He watched her progress as she visited each student's desk. When she got to the boy in the middle, she patted him on the head and skipped past him. He didn't have a workbook or anything else on his desk. And Daniel took a good look at him. If he had to guess, he'd say the boy was around 14 years old, and honestly, he didn't look like he even knew where he was. He turned his attention away from him, and then he heard raised voices. I don't want to do anything. I don't want to do it. I'm not letting some unmated woman boss me around. The only reason I'm here is because the Alpha ordered me to be. Dylan, we've talked about this. You have to do your homework and pay attention in class. Otherwise, there's no reason for you to be here. And why should I listen to anything some stupid woman says? Well, Daniel was surprised when he felt a low growl rumbling in his chest. Well, it seemed everyone had heard it. The few who had been talking went quiet immediately and turned his way, including Veronica and the boy. He took a slow, deep breath to calm himself. Dylan, was it? He asked. He didn't move from his spot, just crossed his arms over his chest. He knew he shouldn't have become involved, that it was none of his business, but he couldn't stand to hear this little brat talking to Veronica that way. The boy, who seemed arrogant and fearless when talking to Veronica, responded. His voice shook a little as he did. Yeah, what of it? You're here because your alpha says you have to be, right? He asked, and the boy seemed to regain some of his bravado. That's what I said, he nodded. And part of going to school is doing your work, listening to what the teacher says and being respectful. Veronica may be a woman, but seeing as she's had a college education, that makes her a hell of a lot smarter than either of us. If you don't feel like listening to her and taking advantage of her lessons, then I may just have a talk with Mikkel myself when I leave here tonight. Is that what you would like? And the boy stared at him in the eyes for nearly a full minute before bowing his head in an obvious submission and putting his workbook out of his desk. Veronica turned to him and gave him a small smile before making her way through the rest of the room. I'll see you all tomorrow, Veronica called as the student started for the door. He stood and made his way to her side when the last one had exited. She didn't turn to him right away. And finally, she said, "About earlier. You didn't have to do that, but thanks." And he shook his head. "Oh, that's no problem," he said, sitting down on a desk, and she walked behind it to gather up all the workbooks the children had turned in that day. "I'm used to behavior like that from him. He's from one of the more traditional families. Most of us have embraced the new ways that Nicholas and Ramus put into effect, but there are some who still cling tightly to the old ways," she said before turning out the lights and pulling the door shut. Things were a lot worse when Bakor, Nicholas's dad, had been alpha. The man had been a traditionalist. Women weren't to speak unless spoken to. They were not allowed outside their homes unless accompanied by a male. They weren't even allowed to learn how to read. Helene was the first person to challenge the old ways. She was always a strong-willed woman, even flat out telling Nicholas no when she learned of their engagement. Of course, he won her over, eventually. After she refused a betrothal, Barker had her punished. He chained her in a shed in the woods in the middle of the summer, with no food and water. And Nicholas was fuming when he learned what his father had done. He demanded that his father release her, but his demands fell on deaf ears. He tried to release her himself, but the guards wouldn't allow him near the shack. And finally, at the end of her 3 days, he went with his father to release her. And she was obviously weak from dehydration and hunger, but when he asked her if she had learned the lesson, she pulled herself up from the ground and stood tall. She told him that women deserved to be treated better, and that no man had a right to lay his hand on a woman for any reason, and if she wanted an education, she should be allowed to get it. Daniel listened to this story in shock, unsure what to say. No wonder Helene was a badass she was today, if that's what she'd been like in her youth. Of course, a man like that wouldn't let her get away with defying him, especially not in front of witnesses. Well, how did he take it? She stopped walking for a moment and leaned into a tree. About as well as you'd expect. He sentenced her to death. Daniel's mouth opened in shock. Veronica nodded. Nicholas loved Helene. He told me it wasn't in spite of her strong will, but because of it. He begged his father to reconsider, but he wouldn't listen. And that's when Nicholas challenged him for the mantle. Oh, it was brutal. Most of the time when we get hurt, our wounds don't scar. And Nicholas's father nearly ripped his right arm off at the shoulder. He still sports the scar to this day. Nicholas managed to get him down, but he wouldn't submit. She sighed. He didn't have a choice, she said, pushing away from the tree, and she began walking again. They were quiet for a while, and he racked his brain for a way to change the subject. So, what was all that about? You being unmated? I mean, you're not even 30 yet. What's the hurry? Veronica gave a short break of laughter, and there was no humor in it. It was quiet again for a while before she answered. At my age in a werewolf pack, if you're not mated, it's because you are undesirable. Deformities. There are even some born occasionally who can shift. And she stopped walking and looked at the ground. The gene pool around here isn't exactly the most diverse. We try to be careful. Most of us do when choosing a mate. But if you're from a family that didn't keep very good records of who married who and whatnot, sometimes mistakes are made. And she didn't have to say any more. He remembered that poor boy in the classroom, the one who hadn't known where he was. And when the children were leaving, one of the younger girls had grabbed his hand to lead him from the room. And she looked back up again and spoke intently. Since he took over from his dad, Nicholas has been doing everything he can to get all the family trees straight, so everyone knows who's related to who and how. To ensure things like that don't happen, but I understand, really. You don't have to explain. And she nodded thankfully and started walking again. He sighed. What about looking for someone in the city and she shook her head. It would be impossible for one of us to be with a human and them not eventually find out. And as you know, secrecy, not just in the pack, but in all packs around the world, is the #1 law. Not to say that it's never happened. The children develop and are born without any concerns. The werewolf gene is only passed on 50% of the time though, but the human partner always finds out eventually. And when they do, they are usually put to death. And she stopped walking again when he did. Nicholas would do that? He would kill a human simply for falling in love with you? And she sighed. He hasn't had to, nor did Ramus, but they would have, if necessary. You know what happened to us. You can't imagine how ingrained the fear is of it happening again. That wasn't the first time our pack's been attacked since it was formed. Regis would have started a war with the humans if he'd found enough support after what happened. It's just as much for human safety as it is for ours, she said. Her voice made it sound like she was begging for his forgiveness. He sighed. He hated to admit it, but he could see the necessity in the cruel thing she said. But not in the way the women were treated. He would speak to Mikkel. It was time things in this pack became better for the women around here. Well, what about the wolves from other packs? She said there were other packs out there. He couldn't help but wonder how many of her kind were out there. Their kind, he had to remind himself. It was still hard to wrap his head around, and she shrugged her shoulders. That does happen on occasion. Most packs stay separate from one another, but on occasion, like when one is attacked by a hunter, the alphas within a certain radius will contact one another. They call it an alpha council, and sometimes when they have one of these, women are traded to more diversify the gene pool. His steps faltered again. They were being traded like cattle. Barker did this a few times, but Nicholas put a stop to it, she said, placing a hand on his arm. Well, turns out trash attracts trash like magnets. He stilled completely when he heard that voice. He looked up. He hadn't realized they'd gotten so close to Helene and Nicholas's home. And Regis was standing on the top step, staring down at them. Instinctively, Daniel took a small step forward and to the side, just enough to angle himself between Regis and Veronica. What do you want? He asked. Honestly, he was surprised his voice had been so strong when he'd asked it. He felt what Dylan must have felt when he was staring him down earlier. And some voice inside of him told him to show submission to this man. And he fought against it. He would never humble himself to a man like him. And Regis descended the steps slowly and stopped only a foot away. And Daniel fought the urge to step back. I came here to deliver a warning to you, he said, taking a step around him. He followed his movements, being sure to keep himself between Regis and Veronica. I don't give a damn what my brother or grandfather say. I'm watching you. You make one slip, give me one reason to even for a moment think you might be a threat, and I'll rip you to shreds, he said right into his ear before turning to walk away. Let's get inside, Veronica said urgently. She grabbed a hold of his sleeve, and he nodded and gave her a gentle push towards the house. She started mounting the steps, but Daniel, he didn't move at first. Hey, Regis, he called out without turning back towards him, and he heard the man's steps falter. I'll be watching you, too, he said, before walking slowly up to the porch, where Veronica waited in shock. Wow. Another one. Wow. Absolutely brilliant stuff. A riveting storyline coming along here with this incredible series. A big thank you to Brandy once again for getting this second installment over to me. What a topsy-turvy year we've all had, and obviously work and other commitments. It's understandable when it takes some time to
pen such a great story like this, but I'm really pleased that you actually got it over to me. Of course, guys and girls, you know the drill here. Please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid Crew. If you're an aspiring writer, want to get in touch with myself at the usual email as on screen, which is dmtforresterfear@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. I hope everybody's well and happy, keeping fit and focused during these testing times. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.